Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The search for an elusive peace in the Middle East consumed much of the best diplomatic and intellectual energy of the late 20th century. Today, the effort to reconcile Israelis and Palestinians is just as avidly pursued and just as critically important to any hope for stability in the world's most volatile region. But if 6 decades of Arab-Israeli conflict have rendered few triumphs for peace, they have provided their own history, an invaluable record of the talents, strategies, and approaches most likely to advance the cause of regional reconciliation. Now, the best of these histories are the personal narratives of diplomats engaged on the front lines of negotiations that often took an exacting emotional toll for every inch of political progress made. The much too promised land is such a story, at once a record of success and failure in Middle East diplomacy and a meditation on what values and strategies may advance the cause of peace in years ahead. My guest is Aaron David Miller, author of The Much Too Promised Land. Aaron, welcome to Dialogue.
George, it's a pleasure to be here.
Let me hold up this very handsome book, which everyone should see and more importantly read. As they can see, it is the Much Too Promised Land. The title tells us a lot, as does the subtitle, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. Aaron, inspired by the title and the subtitle, let me ask you this question. I think I learned a lot about America in the course of reading this book. And I guess this question has two parts. One, the nature of our responsibility to that region. And then second, what we might have learned about the limits of our power in pursuing that responsibility.
Both are very good questions. You know, there are many issues out there in the international system, but not all that many that we can really make a dent in and have an influence on. This one we can, because in my judgment, it brings together three important currents into one stream. Number one, it is in our national interests that we be involved. The security of our friends is absolutely critical and to a resolution of this conflict. Second, our moral interests. It is, after all, the right thing to do, and our foreign policy has always been a blend of self-interest and idealism. There's a Judeo-Christian and Islamic heritage there. It is the cradle of the world's civilizations and religions. So there's a moral ethical component here as well. But if you marry those two, the national and the moral, to the third current, then I think you really see the power and the compelling character of why we need to be involved. We can actually help. Unlike in many different situations of conflict in this world, we have a demonstrated track record when we're wise and courageous, empathetic and tough, to actually help Arabs and Israelis sort out what remains one of the most intractable problems in the world today.
Absolutely. I like those reasons, that combination of the historic and the contemporary, and yes, we can help. The book's very honest, though, about the costs of that help and the frustrations. And here's what I meant by the limits of power, which I think you're very honest about here. There's a beautiful scene in this book where you're out in the region and you're dealing with the constant frustrations of being on the front lines of diplomacy, and someone tells you about American power that out here you're not so big, that there are limits to that. What are those limits like in terms of why are we so often frustrated in trying to help, to put it bluntly?
Well, I argue that there are two mountains that have to be continuously scaled if you're ever going to even get to a place where you can begin to help. One is the problem of how does a great power maneuver in a world of small tribes. I describe that as Gulliver's Trouble,
right?
A term borrowed from Stanley Hoffman's book about Europe. But we are constrained. We are a large power, extremely powerful and affluent, and at times wise, wandering around in a world dominated by powers, smaller powers, meaner, more determined, and in the end, they will always, these small powers, have a more profound stake in the outcome of their struggles than we can ever have, because they are existential struggles. So we are limited, frankly. The notion that America can simply impose, dispose, get what it wants. Iraq, I would argue, is the latest and most tragic cautionary tale of the limitations of American power, particularly when we do not perceive the world out there the way it is, rather in terms of the way we want it to be.
Does that failure to perceive the world as it really is, as opposed to the way we would like it to be, owe in any degree to our, and this has been commented upon, our kind of ahistorical nature as a people, the fact that we don't really appreciate, because a lot of these fights, particularly this Arab-Israeli fight, has legs, as they would say in Hollywood. I mean, it goes back a long way.
Right. We have a reasonably contemporary history, but I would attribute it more to what I call a certain geographic determinism. We are the only great power in the history of the world. Well, first of all, we're the greatest power ever in the history of the world. Very few great powers have enjoyed the physical security and detachment and isolation that we have. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and literally fish to our east and west. We don't know what it's like to live on the knife's edge. And I would argue this physical detachment and isolation explains how we behave abroad. It explains our optimism, my optimism for almost 20 years, that this problem has a solution. I was absolutely persuaded of it, and that we could pursue a kind of split the difference, optimistic American approach to negotiations. It also explains our naivete. We don't know what it's like to be invaded, occupied.
Yeah.
And finally, we are an exceptional power, but it also explains when we don't listen. It explains to some degree our arrogance.
Right. Just a couple of notes on that. Was 9/11 such a rude awakening because that 20 years of initial almost boyish optimism has been replaced by skepticism about a ultimate settlement of the Middle East?
You know, George, failure does that to you. I started my career as an academic and an analyst. I write in the book, I began my career as Dr. No. I was an intelligence analyst in INR charged with following Lebanon and the Palestinians in the 80s, two unbelievably helpless basket cases. When I got aboard the negotiation train, the first Secretary of State that I worked for was George Shultz and then Jim Baker. My Dr. No turned to a pretty unadulterated Dr. Yes. I became a believer. I'm not a religious man, but I became a believer in several articles, which became articles of faith for me. Number one, the Arab-Israeli conflict could be resolved. It had an equitable and durable resolution. Number two, negotiations were the only way you could ever accomplish anything. And number three, America had a key role to play.
Right.
Those three articles of faith, I still want to believe in them, but to a degree they're at sea right now. And I've turned into, I guess, something that I should have been all along, which is a kind of a Dr. Maybe.
Dr. Maybe. Well, let's talk a bit about that personal odyssey, because you can't, the Aaron David Miller, the son of a prominent real estate family from Cleveland, diplomat, emerging skeptic about the process, but still hopeful, is a man, and a man who's very conscious of his own heritage and how this has played into this whole story. And there's a comment in this book where you quote the noted philosopher Michael Jackson, I believe, that if you want to pursue change in any region or a problem like this, you've got to look in the mirror and do that for yourself. Has that been a real fact with you too? And let me be very specific, very candid, and very open, because religion is tied up in this profoundly, and politics, and often the two go hand in hand. And there can be a personal cost paid by someone who wants to both honor his faith, his religion, his heritage, but also be fair to two very troubled antagonists.
Well, there's no question about it. I mean, I'm a member of the American Jewish community. I come from a prominent real estate family in Cleveland, but a prominent Jewish philanthropic family. My grandparents knew intimately Israel's first and fourth prime ministers. My father became personal friends with Yitzhak Rabin. I had very little experience, frankly, with the other side to this conflict when I started. I wrote 2 books, I'm embarrassed to say, on the Palestinians without really having an intimate knowledge or contact with Palestinians. My views underwent a change. I was never, even when I was growing up, what I would call a fundamental believer in the notion that the state of Israel should have a free pass and was a kind of right or wrong ethic, no matter what they did. American Jews, or America, frankly, had to support Israel. But support for the security and sovereignty of a Jewish state, frankly, was part of my political, not a religious man, it was part of my political DNA.
Right.
And you know, what I learned as I went through this journey, meeting Arabs and Palestinians, spending hours and hours and hours into the wee hours of the morning with Arabs and Israelis, trying to get them to trust me and have confidence in me, and certainly in the Secretaries of State that I worked for, it was a very difficult proposition, because everybody in this conflict is marked stereotyped, or cubbyholed. I am now persuaded, based on my quarter of a century of studying this problem, more than that, of working on it, that there is no objectivity. How could there be? We are all sum totals of our experiences, our proclivities, our predispositions, our religions, our ethnic and political DNA. The best you can do, and this, by the way, is a struggle, is to recognize the biases and prejudices that you've got, set them aside, and in the interests of whatever you're doing, analyzing the conflict, trying to resolve it, admit those biases and try to be empathetic to the narratives, the needs, and the requirements of the other side.
Now, that strikes me as wise. I use that word unashamedly. It seems to me if you can do that, you would be, for example, honest about the fact we are close to Israel. We're going to be close to Israel. We always were, we always will. But there's an opportunity in that, as long as we're tough about it,
I think that's right. It's, Sadat was the first to understand the paradox of the partial mediator.
Partial mediator.
The partial mediator, that is to say, if you want something from your friend or your neighbor, and your neighbor won't give it to you, and you can't take it back by force, and you don't want to negotiate directly with your neighbor to get it, then what do? You could wait around until maybe he leaves it and you can take it. But if you don't want to do that, then you have to go to a friend of your friend, and that friend must have confidence and trust of your neighbor. And that, frankly, as long as we don't overdo it, is the secret weapon of American diplomacy in this conflict. The special relationship that we enjoy in an intimate way, the trust and confidence of Israel, is the reason that our phone rings. But we can't allow that special relationship to become exclusive. When it does, we will not be an effective mediator, and frankly, nothing will get done on our side.
We can make it work for everyone if, again, we're...
Exactly, and I've never really fully understood the concerns of some elements in the American Jewish community who believe that there is no way to reconcile the special relationship on one hand with our role as an effective broker on the other.
Right.
I think there is.
And we want to talk about some people. You worked for 6 administrations?
6 secretaries of state.
6 secretaries of state. And we're going to talk about some success stories and some things that were perhaps not so successful because they're very well brought out in this book. I want to ask you this question before we turn to that, though. And this has been a personal odyssey. You've been very candid here about going from initial bursts of optimism, becoming a more seasoned veteran, if you will. So what's the belief now? That, put it bluntly, do you believe that there's like a grand concept, some great awakening, intellectual awakening that will give us a framework, will solve the entire thing, or will be a series of incremental steps and hope that they move the ball forward?
I think, frankly, given the fact that this problem has become so complicated, I can't imagine a worse sort of intersection between Israeli, Palestinian, and regional politics and an absentee American mediator over the course of the last 8 years, which has brought us to a point now when people are really fundamentally questioning whether or not the least bad solution to this conflict, which is a two-state solution, state of Israel coexisting side by side in peace and security to a contiguous independent Palestinian state, whether or not that is still possible. And I never thought I would reach the point where I would fundamentally question whether or not that was still a possibility. I think it's under serious threat. I do not believe that a conflict-ending solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when all sides put aside their claims and reconcile the perfect and the good, finally, is possible right now. I have not given up on the two-state solution, but I think it will not come quickly, and it will not come easily. We are into what I would call, if we're smart, and I'm not sure this administration has much time left, into directed management. Managing the solution in a direction that would leave open the option and possibility for a two-state solution.
But what you're saying is that the idea, and I remember with great excitement when the two-state solution was openly voiced as being, because it sounds wonderful, but we have been absent. We've been away from the table for the past 8 years, and then faith in that possibility has just eroded. Is that the idea?
I think so, and also we have, the fact that Israeli and Palestinian politics have fractionated as they have is not our fault. I mean, we pushed elections, free and fair elections, on a Palestinian Authority who warned us that if you go to elections, the truth is, George, if you go to elections anywhere in the Arab Muslim world today, and they're free and fair, reasonably free and fair, the Islamists will win. because secular nationalism is not alive and well. Communism, of course, has been bankrupted long ago, and that leaves a body of very compelling Islamic thought, organized with faith and lack of corruption as driving forces, and it becomes a powerful force. And that's why in Lebanon, in Iraq, and now in Palestine, these Islamist groups do extremely well.
I'd like to turn, Aaron, to, again, some of the, and they're very colorful personalities, not the least of which is Henry Kissinger, to start this, to talk about when the going was good, so to speak, and when advances were made. Now, I'd like you to give us a sense of why you think Kissinger's diplomacy was so remarkable. One of the things that I was struck by in reading his story is that he boldly, I think I use the phrase intellectual boldness every time I think of Kissinger. He put America in a dominant position in the thing. That was his thing. Move it right to the center. We're going to do this. And he had a close as possible relationship with his president. It seems to me there were at least two of his characteristics.
That's absolutely critical. Although Kissinger, like the other two who succeeded, Carter and Baker, had the raw material out of which he could fashion serious diplomacy. And I want to emphasize this point. It's absolutely critical.
You use bricks and straw to talk
bricks
about that.
Bricks without straw, but you need a brick maker. That's where I am these days. You cannot make brick. It's probably an unfortunate biblical metaphor, but you can't make bricks without straw. If you have the straw,
right.
And the straw, what is the straw? The straw is crisis, the October 1973 Ramadan or Yom Kippur War, which created a sense of urgency and an opportunity. Kissinger was smart enough, tough enough, and as you suggested, empowered enough by his president, who was then, by the way, which is even more remarkable, locked into the crisis that we called Watergate during this period.
That's right.
Kissinger had enormous leeway. Nixon wanted to be there because this was a crisis, and Nixon loved foreign policy. But Kissinger wanted to be there more and could be, and Kissinger put himself at some risk in the middle of the mix, which enabled him to become the repository of the trust and confidence of Anwar Sadat on one hand and Golda Meir and later Yitzhak Rabin on the other. It was a virtuoso performance by a guy who is much criticized and very controversial for pursuing many of his other policies, particularly toward Southeast Asia. But on this one, he was a maestro. 3 disengagement agreements in 18 months. When I interviewed Kissinger, even Kissinger, who has an enormous ego, I remember the Kalb brothers, when they wrote their book on Kissinger at the book party, overheard somebody ask Kissinger, had he read the book, the Kalb's book called Kissinger? And Kissinger said no, but he then added, but I love the title
of it, yeah.
So here was a guy who admitted to me at the close of my interview with him that almost wistfully, he said, it was extraordinary, wasn't it, that in 18 months, we could hammer out 3 disengagement agreements. And he was right. It was remarkable.
It was remarkable. It was an extraordinary episode and extremely well depicted here. Something you just said, though, and having read the book, now it's got a new insight, though. You just said that Kissinger became the repository of faith, so to speak, from parties that otherwise were not going to get together. Would you say the same thing was true of Jimmy Carter? Let's turn to him for a moment, because it seems to me that there's Carter invested himself so powerfully in the Camp David thing. And I saw the Carter episode as kind of 2 stories. There was a kind of not so terrific first half of the game, so to speak, up to the Geneva Conference, and then the ultimate triumph at Camp David. But throughout the whole thing, he was right in it.
Carter, and when I interviewed him, you get this sense. Carter was unique. He was the only senior American official in the history of this conflict that actively ran after it. He came into office without a real sense of crisis or opportunity, unlike Kissinger or eventually Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush. He didn't seem to care. This was an important issue to him. And when you probe him why, I think it goes back to his belief, his faith. As anybody, as I say in the book, who starts off an interview by saying, at the age of 3, I became first interested in the Holy Land. Is a pretty serious guy. And Carter had an obsessive focus and a determination. But even Carter, as steely and as irascible as he was perceived to be by the American Jewish community and by Menachem Begin, managed to hammer out a relationship, certainly with Sadat, but also with Menachem Begin. By the end, they mistrusted each other fundamentally over the settlements question. There's no doubt about that. But he managed to create a measure of trust and a working relationship with Begin. Had he not, there would have been no Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty.
Clarify something for me, to make sure I got it right. Did the document that they must have signed to make this, law, that was an American document, wasn't it? I mean, that both parties were reacting to something that we drafted and redrafted 23 times.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. Which we owned.
Which we own. So
that's the key.
So what you cannot do yourselves alone, we can do for you if you accept that.
We maintain control over the document. And that was the first Camp David experience, which ended happily. We can talk a little bit about the second Camp David experience, which did not end happily.
That's the Clinton. We will get to that.
But no, Jimmy Carter realized that if he put Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin in a room for too long, it would be a disaster. They met twice. And then did not meet again until after the summit was over.
By the same token, though, you'd have to say, and I'm sure you do say, and I'm sure Jimmy Carter would agree, what remarkable partners. Irascible, tough, like two goats who butt heads. But, Sadat going to Israel and Begin being head of Likud, this makes this kind of stuff possible.
Absolutely. Masters of their politics, not prisoners of their constituencies.
Right.
If you had to identify one single fact that makes or breaks an enduring agreement, a negotiation enduring agreement, it's that. It's strong and bold leadership. Sometimes, as Sadat and Rabin found out, it can be fatal. But the risks are existential.
When you speak of masters of their craft, that brings us to Jim Baker. Because of all the people depicted in this book, on any side, he would be my candidate for, and someone calls him Eagleburger, the most superb negotiator or something like that. And what I wasn't aware of was when Jim Baker comes into the story and takes in '91 in the first Bush administration, gets them to the Madrid conference. That's really, I want you to tell us what that conference meant, but it's also, isn't the last agreement we have?
Well, I make the claim in the book, which is fairly stunning, that we have not brokered since 1991 an agreement of consequence between Arabs and Israelis that has endured. We had an Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, but frankly, although we supported it, the Israelis and Jordanians worked out the terms on their own. The answer is yes, and I would argue that the reason we haven't had success is that the issues are more complicated, clearly. The politics are more complex, but the nature of the American role changed. It changed from, I would argue, a tough and honest and effective broker to a facilitator, in the case of Bill Clinton, with the best of intentions, or to a disengager, in the case of George W. Bush. And while America can't do it for them, we will not have it without an American role.
Bill Clinton as facilitator, now we get to that second Camp David thing. It sounds to me like it's almost, and you admire Bill Clinton's extraordinary intellect and leadership, which are true and patent, but that it might have been a case of almost too much love or not enough tough love perhaps, or what was it really that made that not work?
Well, I think, we haven't talked about domestic politics, but I talk in the book about the influences on American policy with respect to the Israelis and the American Jewish community, and now the evangelical community in Congress. And I have a notion in there called the Jewish Lobby of One, which I am persuaded is the most critically important
Prime Minister?
thing to pay attention to, and that is the impact that an Israeli Prime Minister can have on an American Secretary of State and particularly on a president. It's impossible for people to understand what that really means without actually seeing it. Yitzhak Rabin had a relationship with Bill Clinton that is remarkable.
Clinton revered him, it says, apparently.
Clinton revered him, and when I asked some of my former colleagues, I've got him on the record saying this, in large part because Rabin was everything Clinton was not. A tough military man with a sense of history. I mean, a young president from Arkansas, very little foreign policy experience, has for the first time, 9 months after his inauguration, he is presiding on the South Lawn at the White House on September 13th in one of the most extraordinary historic ceremonies ever in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It took Bill Clinton out of the realm of the small and attached him to something quite remarkable. And it transformed him. Bill Clinton wouldn't give me an interview. He was the only former president that I did not interview. I interviewed Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush. But I think in the end, the Jewish lobby have won. First Rabin, then Barack, so transfixed Clinton that he lacked the capacity to say no to bad Israeli ideas. And when it came time to go to Camp David, Bill Clinton and the rest of us, this book is not an I told you so. I was as much a cheerleader for unworkable policies as anybody. We could not resist.
Yeah.
Here was a bold, ultimately, in my judgment, reckless Israeli prime minister, ready to make quite a remarkable offer. But he wanted a conflict-ending agreement, which was simply unattainable in July of 2000. Even had Arafat been ready to negotiate seriously, which frankly in July of 2000 he was not ready to do, we couldn't resist. So Barack captured the tactics and strategy of an American president, just as, I would argue, George W. Bush was influenced by a powerful, large, historic figure in Ariel Sharon.
Aaron David Miller, you've written a remarkable book, and I hope and believe that our listeners and viewers have gotten a sense of it through this conversation. I will commend you again, not just on the encyclopedic scope of this book and the extraordinary detail, but the great honesty. That, to me, I thought was particularly moving. And I'll conclude our conversation just with this comment. You've mentioned in past your reverence for John Kennedy and his notion of being a president who could be an idealist without illusions. And this will call for a one-word response. Do you think that's the kind of thing our next president should be?
Absolutely.
In terms of the Middle East?
That's where we are. I mean, never give up on the possibility that the world can be changed, but do so with your eyes open.
With your help, we won't give up. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcnetworks.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Aaron Miller.
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.